It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in early May when Daniel Price, 28, arrived at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. The sun had barely climbed above the skyline, but the hospital's maternity wing was already alive with the usual blend of anticipation and anxiety. Daniel's hands shook slightly, not with fear, but with the unmistakable thrill of becoming a father for the first time. His partner, Sarah, was in the delivery suite, hours away from meeting their daughter, and Daniel had arrived early to settle in, to be present for every detail he could grasp. The air smelt faintly of antiseptic, mingled with the subtle warmth of freshly baked hospital pastries, a mundane comfort amid the charged atmosphere. Friends and family trickled into the waiting area, filling the room with chatter that oscillated between nervous laughter and whispered encouragement. Daniel moved through the group with an easy smile, shaking hands, embracing those who had come to support them. Yet beneath his jovial demeanor there was a quiet intensity, an awareness that life, as he knew it, was about to change forever. The hospital's staff were methodical, efficient, and accustomed to the ebb and flow of anticipation that came with births. Nurses and attendants moved from room to room, checking vitals, updating charts, and offering guidance to anxious partners. Daniel watched intently, asking questions about the timing, the procedure, and the expected progress. He joked lightly with the nurse who had helped Sarah during early labor, a glimmer of humor cutting through the tension, but his eyes betrayed a constant, almost obsessive focus on the clock, the door, and the faint sounds coming from the delivery room. He seemed determined to witness everything, to anchor himself in the presence of this life he had helped create. For Daniel, the world outside these walls had ceased to exist. All that mattered was Sarah, their child, and the fragile, fleeting moments before the baby arrived. By late afternoon, the birth was imminent. Sarah's contractions had intensified, the hospital room charged with the raw energy of impending labor. Friends gathered near the door, offering encouragement, squeezing Daniel's shoulder when words failed. He paced briefly, restless, then excused himself to make a phone call. His steps echoed down the sterile corridor, the hum of hospital equipment providing a soft, constant backdrop. Surveillance cameras captured him leaving the maternity ward, phone pressed to his ear, a figure composed, deliberate, and ordinary in every way. And then, inexplicably, he vanished. The footage showed him walking into the elevator, then out of the building. After that, there was nothing. No record of him entering a car, no security alert, no witness seeing him on the surrounding streets. It was as though he had dissolved into the air, leaving only a void in the space he had occupied moments before. Inside the delivery suite, Sarah's world shifted. The moment Daniel left, the thin veil of normalcy unraveled. She felt the absence of his presence as a tangible weight pressing against her chest, even as nurses encouraged her through the labor. Minutes stretched into hours, each tick of the clock amplifying the realization that Daniel had not returned. She tried calling his phone, her hands trembling so violently she could barely dial. Every ring ended in voicemail. Panic began to take root, a slow-growing fear that spread with each unanswered call, each step echoing in the empty corridors outside. Friends and family noticed her anxiety and moved to comfort her, but nothing could fill the sudden, unexplainable void left by the man she loved. Once Emma was born, a fragile, wailing presence in Sarah's arms, the weight of Daniel's disappearance became unbearable. She cradled her daughter, trying to focus on the tiny fingers and perfect features that were all too quickly reminding her of the man who was no longer there. Hospital staff documented the birth and assisted Sarah in the first hours of nursing, but even their steady presence could not counteract the gnawing fear that had taken hold. A missing persons report was filed almost immediately, though the circumstances were so unusual that officers initially treated it with cautious disbelief. Daniel had not argued with anyone, had not left a note, and had not hinted at discontent. There was no motive apparent to anyone involved. Outside the hospital, the police began canvassing the area, retracing Daniel's steps with painstaking care. Officers reviewed elevator logs, street camera footage, and witness statements from everyone who had interacted with him that morning. Each inquiry returned the same chilling result. Daniel had left the hospital and had not been seen again. Security footage, precise and unemotional, documented only the last fleeting moments of his presence. Detectives interviewed nurses, administrative staff, and visiting family members, but each person's memory was vague, fragmented, and unreliable in the smallest ways that would later loom large in the investigation. Everyone remembered him pacing, laughing lightly, checking his phone, and offering encouragement. No one recalled seeing him after he stepped out for that call. The tension inside St. Mary's grew as the hours passed. News of Daniel's disappearance traveled quickly among staff, rippling through the hospital in hushed conversations. Sarah remained in her room, holding Emma, occasionally glimpsing the phone as if it might suddenly buzz with the impossible message that Daniel was safe. Friends rotated in, bringing snacks, tissues, and quiet reassurances, though their words felt hollow against the stark reality. Daniel Price, a man full of life, laughter, and excitement that very morning, had vanished. And in that disappearance, a series of questions began to form, questions that would haunt everyone connected to him for years. Where did he go? Why did he leave? And how could someone so present, so alive, simply disappear without a trace? By the end of the day, the hospital corridors were quiet again, sterile and impersonal, leaving only the echo of absence. Sarah rocked Emma in the dim light of the maternity suite, listening to her baby's tiny breaths and feeling the cold weight of uncertainty pressing against her. Outside, detectives planned their next steps, unaware that this disappearance would evolve into a case defined by subtle clues, missed details, and the extraordinary resilience of memory and human connection. Daniel Price had stepped out for a phone call, but that step had carried him into a mystery that would stretch for years, leaving a newborn daughter, a devastated partner, and a community desperate for answers. The first day of Emma's life was also the first day a disappearance was etched into the lives of those who loved Daniel most, an absence that would define them and the unfolding story of a father lost in the most ordinary yet inexplicably haunting way imaginable. The first hours after Daniel Price vanished were a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Hospital staff moved with a heightened sense of urgency, their usual routines fractured by the impossible reality that a man could walk out of a bustling medical center and simply vanish. Security personnel retraced corridors, elevators, and stairwells, reviewing surveillance footage frame by frame. Each screen revealed the same final images: Daniel, composed, carrying a phone to his ear, stepping into the elevator and exiting into the street beyond. Beyond that point, the cameras offered nothing. Every door that led outside had registered his passing, yet no witnesses reported seeing him leave, no vehicle registration matched his description, and the streets that should have held some trace of him remained empty and indifferent. Sarah remained at the center of this storm, cradling newborn Emma while panic gnawed at her resolve. She spoke in measured fragments to the police, recounting the day with painstaking precision, as though meticulously cataloging each heartbeat could somehow reconstruct Daniel's path. She remembered the way he had laughed with a nurse over some minor joke, the way he had straightened his tie after pacing the waiting area, and the fleeting gestures toward the clock as though time itself mattered. Every detail was sharp and vivid, yet in the telling, she found herself questioning even her own memory. Was it possible she had misremembered his departure, or overlooked something trivial that now carried significance? Detectives listened intently, taking notes and cross-referencing her account with those of friends and hospital staff, slowly piecing together a timeline that refused to make sense. Outside the hospital, uniformed officers canvassed the surrounding streets. Sidewalks and alleyways were meticulously combed, security cameras on neighboring buildings reviewed, and every potential exit scrutinized. Neighbors were interviewed, drivers questioned, and delivery personnel cross-examined, yet each inquiry returned the same unnerving result: no one saw Daniel. No witness placed him in the streets, no suspicious vehicle was noted, and no accidental fall or altercation was recorded. It was as if he had stepped into a void, leaving behind only the faint echo of his presence in the hospital corridors. The police, experienced in missing person cases, felt the chill of uncertainty settle over them. This was not the typical runaway or impulsive disappearance. There was no history of distress, no financial or personal conflict, and no signs of intent. Detectives began tracing the smallest threads of potential leads. They reviewed hospital logs, checked patient and staff sign-ins, and interviewed anyone who had briefly interacted with Daniel that day. Each conversation revealed subtle inconsistencies. One nurse recalled him smiling nervously near the reception desk. Another remembered seeing him pause to glance at the elevator panel before entering. Friends differed on whether he had returned from the restroom before the call and whether he had waved or merely nodded. These minor contradictions were not uncommon in high-stress environments, yet in the context of a disappearance so precise, they took on a weight that unsettled investigators. Every detail was examined, every memory compared. Yet the resulting picture remained fragmentary, a mosaic with a critical piece missing. The hospital itself offered no clues. Security checks revealed all doors and emergency exits functioning normally. No alarms had been triggered, no maintenance doors left ajar, and no hazards reported that could have caused an accidental injury. His clothing, wallet, and phone had been accounted for. Nothing missing, nothing left behind to suggest a struggle or voluntary disappearance. In the absence of evidence, speculation began to creep in. Could a sudden medical episode have led him out of sight? Was it possible he had experienced a moment of disorientation, wandering off unnoticed? Officers investigated nearby hospitals, clinics, and public transportation hubs, hoping to catch the faintest trace of his presence, but each lead evaporated upon contact. Sarah's recounting became an obsessive cycle, revisiting the morning and early afternoon repeatedly. Searching for overlooked details. She questioned herself constantly. Had she been distracted? Had she not noticed a change in his demeanor? Had she misunderstood his intentions? Detectives allowed her to speak freely, sensing that her detailed recollection, combined with the hospital's systematic records, might illuminate subtle inconsistencies otherwise lost in the chaos. Meanwhile, friends and family offered fragmented recollections, sometimes contradicting each other in ways that only deepened the sense of unease. Days stretched into a week with no resolution. Police expanded their search radius, issuing alerts across the city, distributing flyers, and connecting with media outlets to raise awareness. Social media profiles were monitored, bank and credit card activity checked, and all known contacts were interviewed. Yet the trail remained cold. The suddenness and precision of Daniel's disappearance created a pervasive tension. A man had walked out of a secure, heavily trafficked hospital, leaving no trace, and no logical explanation surfaced. The case confounded even seasoned investigators, each failed lead compounding the uncertainty and heightening the emotional toll on those left behind. Through it all, Sarah remained the anchor in a world of chaos. She returned to Emma's bedside repeatedly, sometimes speaking aloud as though Daniel might hear her, describing every detail of the day, retracing his last steps in a desperate attempt to summon answers. The baby, unaware of the storm surrounding her existence, clung to life and routine, feeding and sleeping with unknowing grace. Sarah's grief was punctuated by flashes of hope, fleeting suspicions that Daniel might appear, each false alarm cutting deeper than the last. The first week ended without a breakthrough, leaving behind a haunting quiet. St. Mary's Hospital resumed its routines, but the air remained tense. The echo of Daniel's absence was felt in hallways, staff rooms, and waiting areas. Friends, family, and police were united in their confusion and fear, forced to confront a disappearance that defied expectation, circumstance, and reason. It was a disappearance that would not remain static, that would grow into a mystery defined by the imperceptible, the fleeting, and the precise. And it was in these earliest days, in the frantic searches and painstaking interviews, that the first threads of a far more complex story began to take shape, threads that would stretch across years and challenge the limits of memory, observation, and human understanding. Weeks turned into a blur of uncertainty, each day stretching longer than the last, and still Daniel Price remained absent. The initial shock of his disappearance had evolved into a gnawing, persistent anxiety. Detectives continued to follow procedural steps, reviewing records and interviewing acquaintances, yet each avenue seemed to lead nowhere. Friends and family offered theories, some cautiously hopeful, others tinged with suspicion. A few whispered about the possibility of a voluntary disappearance, speculating that Daniel might have been under unspoken stress or grappling with personal struggles. It was an uncomfortable suggestion, one that Sarah found nearly impossible to entertain. Yet the detectives could not dismiss it outright. Investigators meticulously examined his financial history. Bank accounts, credit card statements, and routine transactions revealed nothing unusual. There were no large withdrawals, no transfers that suggested planning for an extended absence. Phone records were similarly unremarkable. Calls and messages followed expected patterns, with no indications of hidden conversations or secret contacts. Emails were scrutinized line by line, revealing only the familiar: work correspondence, family planning, and friendly check-ins. Each record reinforced the impossibility of the situation. A man could disappear so completely without leaving the slightest trace of intent or forewarning. Detectives expanded the search radius, checking local hospitals, homeless shelters, and transportation hubs. They reached out to neighboring police departments and monitored traffic cameras that could have captured his movements. Leads came and went. A tip from a driver who thought he had seen someone matching Daniel's description on the outskirts of the city, and an anonymous email claiming knowledge of his whereabouts. Each potential clue was investigated thoroughly, only to dissolve into frustration. None bore fruit, leaving the case suspended in an uneasy limbo. Media coverage intensified. Local news outlets reported the disappearance, painting a picture of a young father lost in an inexplicable vanishing act. Public interest surged, but along with it came speculation, sometimes harsh. Opinion pieces debated whether Daniel had abandoned his family, portraying him as a man fleeing responsibility. For Sarah, the media's portrayal felt like salt on a wound, twisting grief into anger and confusion. She found herself explaining the situation repeatedly to friends, family, and even strangers who approached her in public. Each conversation forced her to relive the day Daniel disappeared, a cycle of hope and despair that left her emotionally drained. Through it all, Sarah's focus remained on Emma. The baby, just weeks old when Daniel vanished, became both her anchor and her compass. She meticulously documented milestones, first smiles, tentative movements, and early words. She captured photographs, recorded moments, and spoke aloud about Daniel, narrating memories as though he could hear her through the haze of absence. Each small triumph in Emma's development was a bittersweet reminder of what Daniel had missed and what they had lost together. The house, once full of anticipation and laughter, was now a space of quiet determination, a place where grief and hope coexisted. Community support gradually grew. Neighbors organized check-ins, friends offered meals and childcare, and even casual acquaintances expressed concern. Volunteers joined search parties, leaving flyers in local businesses and residential areas. Support groups for families of missing persons reached out, providing guidance and resources. Yet no matter the comfort or camaraderie, the absence of Daniel remained stark. Every unanswered question pressed against the edges of daily life, a shadow that refused to recede. Detectives revisited interviews, hoping to spot inconsistencies or overlooked details. Small discrepancies emerged in recollections, not in a way that indicated malice, but as a reminder of human fallibility under stress. One coworker recalled a casual remark Daniel had made about needing a break, though it was dismissed at the time as idle conversation. Another friend remembered him mentioning a long-forgotten uncle in another state, now unearthed in background checks. Yet each new detail, while intriguing, failed to provide direction. Every lead was a potential avenue, every possibility a temporary distraction from the gnawing emptiness of inaction. Sarah, navigating this uncharted reality as a single mother, learned to reconcile routine with grief. She developed a meticulous structure, balancing work, childcare, and her own attempts to process what had happened. Friends and family provided support, yet the burden of uncertainty weighed heavily. Nights were particularly difficult when the quiet of the apartment was broken only by Emma's breathing and the unspoken absence beside her. Sarah sometimes found herself speaking to Daniel aloud, recounting Emma's daily activities, sharing triumphs, and hoping, irrationally, that her words might reach him. The dead end of the investigation also affected her perception of the community. Casual conversations with neighbors or fellow parents often carried undercurrents of judgment or pity. Sarah learned to navigate questions with calm neutrality, masking the tempest within. She recorded her experiences in journals, capturing thoughts that were too raw to share aloud, preserving memory as a tether to a reality Daniel had once shared. These records became a private chronicle of survival and hope, a testament to resilience in the face of inexplicable loss. Amid the frustration, Sarah clung to the belief that Daniel would return. There was no evidence, no message, no note, only the fragments of memory and the steady pulse of hope that he might reappear. Each day became a careful negotiation between living and waiting, between accepting absence and refusing surrender. Friends encouraged her to consider all possibilities, to prepare for outcomes both hopeful and tragic, yet the emotional gravity of each scenario was profound. Even as the investigation reached a stagnant plateau, the early theories and dead ends laid the foundation for the next phase of the case. Detectives, community members, and Sarah herself were unknowingly moving toward discoveries that would challenge assumptions and expose the hidden threads of a mystery that had begun with a single unremarkable phone call. The story of Daniel Price was far from over. It was only gathering momentum, the silent question of his disappearance quietly evolving into something that would eventually pierce through years of uncertainty and grief. 2 months into the investigation, the initial shock had settled into a tense rhythm of uncertainty, and detectives began to search for patterns in Daniel Price's life that might explain the inexplicable. They combed through his social interactions, phone records, and digital footprints, looking for connections that had been overlooked in the first chaotic weeks. A subtle thread emerged. Daniel had recently visited a small network of friends linked to alternative wellness retreats and fringe psychological communities. These were spaces dedicated to self-exploration, meditation, and intensive mental exercises, places often described by participants as transformative, sometimes isolating, and occasionally extreme in their practices. Investigators noted that while the retreats were legal and public, the cultures within them could foster a detachment from conventional responsibilities, and the risk of individuals stepping away from daily life without notice was not unheard of. Detectives began visiting these groups under the guise of ordinary inquiries, speaking with organizers and participants in quiet cafes and private settings. They gathered anecdotal stories of men who had temporarily disappeared to explore themselves, leaving loved ones bewildered and returning days or weeks later with a renewed sense of purpose. Some accounts described guided meditations so intense that participants would voluntarily isolate from society for extended periods. Others told of psychological exercises designed to sever ties with the ordinary world for brief intervals, a voluntary absence framed as spiritual or mental discovery. The investigators meticulously documented each account, cross-referencing dates and locations with Daniel's known movements. Still, no evidence suggested he had planned such a disappearance, no ticket purchases, no missing weekend reservations, and no pretexts that would align with these practices. Meanwhile, at home, Sarah's attention to Emma revealed an odd, unsettling phenomenon. The infant, barely months old, reacted differently to certain photographs of Daniel. When a particular image surfaced, one of him smiling at the maternity ward shortly before his disappearance, Emma's gaze lingered longer, her small hands reaching toward the picture as if recognizing a presence she could not possibly recall. Sarah initially dismissed it as coincidence, a child responding to familiar facial shapes. Yet, the reactions repeated across multiple photographs in varying contexts, Daniel holding her as a newborn, standing outside the hospital entrance, laughing at a family gathering. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Emma seemed to respond to her father's memory, even though she had been only a few weeks old when he vanished. These observations troubled Sarah. Was her daughter exhibiting signs of early memory retention, or was it something else entirely, an inexplicable connection that bordered on the uncanny? She began documenting Emma's responses meticulously, photographing each moment, noting times, expressions, and triggers. The documentation became a private obsession, a compulsion to trace the invisible threads linking her child to a man who had disappeared into thin air. While the detectives pursued tangible leads in the real world, Sarah's personal investigation ventured into the ethereal, the psychological, and the subtle emotional cues that could not be quantified. For the detectives, the combination of alternative community involvement and subtle personal clues was perplexing. On one hand, the retreats presented a plausible narrative. Daniel could have voluntarily entered a space designed for detachment. On the other hand, no tangible evidence suggested he had actually done so. There were no appointments recorded under his name, no witnesses recalling his presence during the relevant timeframes, and no financial transactions to support participation. Each conversation in the fringe communities produced speculation rather than fact. Men disappeared from these retreats for introspection, but their returns were usually accounted for, and they left a trail, however minor. Daniel's trail ended abruptly at the hospital exit, leaving only silence beyond that point. Community members became a focus of the investigation, though slowly and carefully. Detectives approached acquaintances with a balance of tact and persistence, aware that overzealous questioning could alienate individuals who might hold key insights. Some participants described Daniel as curious, adventurous, and open to exploring unconventional mental spaces. Others recalled casual remarks about the pressure of impending fatherhood, stress about responsibilities, or a desire for temporary isolation. Nothing definitively connected him to a voluntary disappearance, but the hints of psychological exploration added a layer of complexity the detectives could not ignore. Sarah, meanwhile, wrestled with her own theories. She questioned whether Daniel's attraction to these communities might have led him into a space from which he could not, or would not, return easily. Perhaps there had been a psychological misstep, an unintentional separation that became permanent. Perhaps Emma's responses to photographs were echoes of an imprint left before birth, or an emotional resonance that her infant mind had registered. Every new observation felt like a whisper from Daniel, a bridge spanning the impossible gap between his absence and her presence. The case now straddled two realms, the tangible and the intangible, the physical disappearance and the emotional resonance left behind. Detectives mapped potential pathways, documenting every retreat, every alternative therapy, and every known contact who might have interacted with Daniel in the weeks before he vanished. Simultaneously, Sarah cataloged each subtle recognition, every moment where Emma seemed to call her father back from memory. Each lead and each reaction was carefully noted, feeding a growing sense that the story of Daniel Price was far from ordinary. By the end of the second month, the investigation had transformed. What began as a straightforward missing person case now encompassed hidden patterns, unseen clues, and psychological enigmas that defied easy explanation. Detectives had not yet reached a breakthrough, and Sarah's observations introduced a personal, almost mystical dimension to the search. The disappearance was no longer simply a matter of location or timing. It was a puzzle involving memory, emotional connection, and subtle human behavior. Both the law and the heart were engaged, and the threads of the case were weaving a complex tapestry that promised revelations yet to come. It was clear to everyone involved that the mystery was deepening, not loosening, and the next discovery, whether tangible or psychological, would demand attention, intuition, and perhaps a willingness to confront truths that were previously unimaginable. The story of Daniel Price had entered a stage where every small observation could become a key, every overlooked pattern a doorway. And the invisible lines linking father, daughter, and disappearance had begun to hint at the shape of answers still to be found. As Daniel Price's disappearance moved past the local news cycle, the story suddenly exploded onto national platforms. Morning shows, investigative segments, and human interest outlets picked up the tale of a new father vanishing from a hospital with no explanation, leaving behind a newborn daughter and a bewildered partner. Sarah Price found herself thrust into a public role she had never sought, her grief and confusion displayed on camera for millions to witness. She spoke carefully, recounting the day with painstaking clarity, emphasizing both the love she and Daniel shared and the impossibility of his absence. Her words were measured, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion, a weariness that would not leave her for years. While media attention brought sympathy, it also brought speculation. Headlines questioned Daniel's motives, some subtly suggesting abandonment or hidden secrets, and internet forums erupted with theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Almost immediately, law enforcement offices were inundated with tips from across the country. Individuals called claiming to have spotted Daniel in coffee shops, airports, suburban streets, and even in distant states. Yeah, detectives logged each report meticulously, understanding that even a false lead could conceal a genuine clue. Teams were dispatched to verify locations, interview witnesses, and examine security footage. Yet time and again, these sightings proved mistaken. Faces did not match, timelines conflicted, and physical evidence failed to corroborate claims. Some callers admitted they had misremembered, while others confessed to hoaxes, motivated perhaps by curiosity or the thrill of influencing a national story. The relentless flow of calls created a background noise of hope and frustration, leaving detectives constantly assessing which paths were worth pursuing. Despite the chaos surrounding the investigation, life at home pressed onwards with its own quiet rhythms. Emma, now learning to walk and speak, became Sarah's anchor. Every milestone was documented with an obsessive care that blended necessity with longing. First words were recorded in notebooks, first steps captured on video, and every small gesture meticulously catalogued. It was in these intimate observations that something peculiar began to emerge. Even as a toddler, Emma's drawings suggested a consistent, recurring motif, a figure with precise facial features and proportions that seemed too deliberate for a child of her age. She sketched the man in various poses, holding a hand, standing apart, looking down, with a clarity that startled Sarah. Though Emma had no conscious memory of Daniel, her drawings carried the imprint of a man she could not have known, a representation that seemed uncannily accurate. Sarah showed the sketches to family and close friends, initially fearing the reactions would dismiss her concern as maternal projection. Instead, observers were struck by the uncanny resemblance. Some described the drawings as hauntingly specific, others noted the consistency in posture and facial structure. The sketches became a subtle yet eerie focal point, a bridge between the absence of the father and the presence of memory or intuition in his daughter. While detectives could not act on the drawings in any formal investigative sense, Sarah found solace in the strange consistency, interpreting them as signals that Daniel's identity lingered, somehow accessible through the child he had never truly known. Public attention intensified as the story circulated online, and forums dissected Emma's sketches with fascination and fear. Some viewers speculated about genetic memory or early cognitive imprinting. Others suggested coincidences or parental influence. Sarah remained private about the degree to which she encouraged her daughter's artistic habits, insisting she merely provided paper and crayons, allowing Emma to express herself freely. Still, the pattern in the drawings could not be denied, and it drew a renewed wave of interest from reporters seeking updates and human interest segments, highlighting the resilience of mother and child. In the background, detectives continued chasing leads, each false sighting teaching them to refine their protocols. Investigators established a more systematic process, cross-checking tips against travel records, surveillance footage, and witness statements. They became increasingly adept at identifying misidentifications and hoaxes quickly. Yet the volume of calls created an exhausting rhythm that sometimes left them questioning whether any lead would prove fruitful. Meanwhile, Sarah's documentation of Emma added an unquantifiable layer to the investigation, a private, emotional trail that intertwined grief with hope. Each drawing, each word, each repeated gesture became a piece of the evolving narrative that would later prove critical in understanding the full mystery. As months progressed, the combination of media attention and public speculation began to shift. Law enforcement teams received calls from strangers inspired by Emma's drawings, reporting sightings of a man whose description strangely aligned with the child's sketches. Although most were dismissed after verification, a few contained details that had previously gone unnoticed in the initial search. Subtle elements, small accessories, specific gestures, unique physical traits appeared in both the sketches and eyewitness reports, creating a faint but intriguing pattern. Detectives marked these as anomalies, unresolved threads that hinted at something beyond ordinary disappearance. Through it all, Sarah navigated the dual pressures of public scrutiny and private mourning. She balanced interviews, media appearances, and community support groups with the quiet but consuming work of raising Emma. Her life had become a blend of relentless hope and cautious skepticism, an emotional tightrope where every interaction, whether a news segment, a tip call, or a child's drawing, carried profound significance. Emma's emerging artistic expressions were the sole threads connecting Sarah to the father she had lost, subtle reminders that the mystery was not only external, but deeply personal, residing in memory, intuition, and the silent language of a child's perception. By the end of this phase, the case had evolved into a layered tapestry. Detectives piecing together tangible leads, the public consumed with fascination and conjecture, and a mother observing her daughter with the meticulous attention of someone charting invisible lines of connection. The intersection of tips, hoaxes, sketches, and subtle recognitions set the stage for a breakthrough, an approach toward clarity that would eventually resolve the mystery. Emma's drawings, previously dismissed as mere childlike imitation, had quietly established themselves as a unique and haunting clue, one that would later guide investigators toward the truth of Daniel Price's disappearance, proving that the invisible threads connecting father, daughter, and the wider world were stronger than anyone had anticipated. 5 years passed with a rhythm that was at once painfully slow and relentlessly unyielding. Daniel Price remained absent, a void that had hardened into the center of Sarah's life. Each day was measured by the routines of survival, preparing meals, managing bills, ensuring Emma's growth, and attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy in a world that no longer felt entirely secure. The media had long since moved on, the public's fascination replaced by newer headlines, but Sarah could not let go. Every photograph, every drawing, every memory was a thread connecting her to the man who had vanished with such precision. She documented everything meticulously, preserving the fragments of Daniel in both tangible and subtle ways. Yet the years of silence left her grappling with a deeper, gnawing question. If he had truly disappeared, was there any way to trace the echoes of his presence in the life he had left behind? Emma grew into a curious, intelligent child, her words shaping into sentences that often startled Sarah with their insight, and as she matured, so did her drawings. The simple sketches that had once captured the vague outline of a man now developed an extraordinary specificity. She began drawing a figure holding a baby, an image that matched Daniel's posture, facial structure, and even certain idiosyncratic gestures captured in photographs Sarah had taken years earlier. At first, Sarah questioned her own perception. Could a child so young, with no conscious memory of her father, reproduce such a precise likeness by coincidence? She scanned through her collection of Emma's early artwork and realized a startling pattern. The sketches repeated consistently, each iteration refining detail rather than diverging into abstract imagination. Sarah sought professional guidance, contacting forensic psychologists and child development specialists. She brought Emma's artwork to experts, carefully documenting her observations alongside each piece. The responses were unanimous in their surprise. Specialists noted that the probability of a child reproducing, with such accuracy, a person she had never consciously remembered was statistically improbable. The drawings displayed features and postures that went beyond standard child development capabilities, suggesting a latent memory encoded either instinctively or through a subconscious imprint. Some psychologists proposed that the images were expressions of attachment, a means of manifesting emotional bonds that existed beneath conscious cognition. Others remained cautious, emphasizing that human memory, especially in children, could not easily be interpreted with certainty. Still, the precision of Emma's depictions could not be ignored. As these revelations unfolded, tension in Sarah's household escalated. The years of silence had brought a quiet despair, but now hope flickered unpredictably, fragile and insistent. Each drawing was both a comfort and a torment. On some days, Emma's portrayals appeared as tender recreations, a father cradling his child, offering the warmth of a connection that had been physically severed. On others, the images were more enigmatic, showing Daniel standing apart, looking beyond the edges of the paper, a silent presence neither fully engaged nor absent. Sarah began cataloging these images with obsessive care, maintaining chronological records to observe patterns, minute changes, and recurring details. The exercise was as much for her own understanding as it was for potential investigative purposes. Simultaneously, Sarah reflected on her own memories, cross-referencing her recollections of Daniel with the drawings. Certain nuances stood out: the tilt of his head, the slope of his shoulders, the way he held a child's weight. The sketches echoed these details with startling accuracy, suggesting that Emma's work was a reflection not only of instinctive familiarity, but of an imprint that had somehow survived the trauma of separation. For Sarah, the implications were profound. The absence of physical evidence or sightings had left the case stagnant for years, but here, in the quiet of her home, an unexpected trail had emerged. It was subtle, intangible, yet impossibly compelling. Friends and family observed the phenomenon with a mixture of awe and concern. Sarah shared select sketches selectively, aware that publicizing them might invite skepticism or misinterpretation. Yet, among those who understood the context, the obsessive attention to detail, the continuity of the depictions, and the uncanny alignment with known photographs, the reactions were consistent. Emma's artwork suggested a connection deeper than casual observation or imagination. Sarah felt a renewed determination. She began coordinating with child psychologists and law enforcement advisors to consider whether these images could provide investigatory insight, potentially guiding searches, interviews, or forensic analysis in ways previously overlooked. Life continued with its delicate balance of normalcy and scrutiny. Emma attended school, developed friendships, and explored her interests, while Sarah remained vigilant, documenting both the ordinary and extraordinary. The interplay between daily life and the persistent echoes of Daniel's absence created a tension that was almost physical. Every moment of laughter was shadowed by the persistent question of whether the man in the drawings was more than a memory. The process was slow, iterative, and emotionally taxing. Sarah found herself oscillating between hope and despair, understanding that these sketches represented both possibility and uncertainty. A haunting reminder that the truth could remain just beyond reach. By the end of the 5th year, the cumulative effect of Emma's drawings had become undeniable. Each depiction reinforced a pattern, an image of Daniel that was unmistakable in its fidelity and emotional resonance. The forensic psychologist's assessments gave Sarah the courage to hope once more, suggesting that these illustrations were more than creative invention. They were a conduit for something real, a reflection of a father's presence encoded within a child's perception. This realization shifted Sarah's approach to the disappearance. No longer purely a case of searching for missing persons, it now incorporated the subtle, mysterious evidence of instinctive memory, bridging the gap between absence and presence, loss and recognition. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine that Daniel's trace, preserved through Emma's art, might one day lead to clarity. The slow realization that a child's instinctive memory could guide investigation redefined the boundaries of the search. While the years of silence had tested patience, resilience, and faith, the emergence of these uncanny drawings reignited hope. Fragile, delicate, but undeniable, a spark that suggested the mystery might yet yield to revelation. Sarah's determination to uncover the truth about Daniel's disappearance had intensified over the years, fueled by the uncanny accuracy of Emma's drawings. Each sketch was a small window into a presence long thought lost, a visual memory that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. By the time Emma was 7, Sarah realized that the drawings were no longer simply comforting reminders. They might constitute real evidence, a silent guide pointing toward the missing pieces of the case. She contacted the local detective assigned to Daniel's file, presenting the collection of Emma's artwork alongside the photographs of Daniel she had preserved with meticulous care. Initially met with polite skepticism, the detective soon recognized the potential significance when the details in the drawings were compared directly with hospital and family photographs. The alignment was remarkable. The hairline, the subtle slope of his shoulders, even minor expressions that could easily go unnoticed by an ordinary observer. All were reproduced in a way that suggested more than imagination. Forensic analysts joined the review, documenting each correspondence between the drawings and photographs with precision. They noted that even Emma's slight deviations in posture appeared intentional, a subtle reflection of different emotional states captured in Daniel's images over time. Investigators began to see patterns that had been overlooked for years. It was no longer a matter of assuming Daniel had vanished into obscurity. The child's work provided a tangible set of markers that could be traced and cross-referenced with known timelines, locations, and social interactions prior to his disappearance. Sarah, observing the process, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The potential to finally understand what had happened to Daniel was exhilarating. Yet it was accompanied by the familiar ache of uncertainty, the possibility that even this breakthrough might lead only to further questions. Detectives revisited every corner of the unsolved case. Traffic camera footage that had been archived as inconclusive was re-examined, this time with guidance informed by Emma's sketches. Minor sightings that had once been dismissed as misidentifications were scrutinized, with investigators noting similarities in posture, stride, and timing that had previously gone unnoticed. Even Daniel's last known movements, routine errands, brief visits to friends, and social interactions were mapped against the new patterns emerging from Emma's work. Slowly, a coherent timeline began to form, one that suggested deliberate, planned absence rather than impulsive disappearance. The theory of voluntary evasion, once dismissed in public speculation, began to gain credibility within investigative circles. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when a distant relative came forward during a follow-up interview. She recounted a fleeting memory from shortly after Daniel vanished. A man resembling him walking along a quiet suburban street in a town nearly 2 hours from his last known location. The relative remembered small, ordinary details: a coat he wore, the tilt of his head, the way he carried a bag. At the time, the sight had seemed trivial, a fleeting glimpse easily dismissed. Now, juxtaposed against the markers derived from Emma's drawings and the revisited investigative data, the recollection took on profound significance. It suggested that Daniel's absence was not chaotic or random. There was a logic, a deliberate structure that had been missed entirely in the initial inquiries. Sarah watched as detectives traced this new lead, contacting local residents, reviewing property cameras, and searching public records for any sign of Daniel's presence in the area. Each piece of data was cross-referenced against Emma's sketches, creating a network of points that, while incomplete, began to illuminate his trajectory. It was a painstaking process, with countless hours spent verifying, discarding, and validating every lead. Yet with each small confirmation, the case shifted from one of hopeless disappearance to one of intentional movement. Daniel had not simply vanished, he had moved in a calculated way, a pattern now visible to those who were willing to look beyond assumptions. Meanwhile, Sarah observed Emma's continued engagement with her drawings. The girl seemed almost aware of the significance of her work, adding details and refining features in a way that suggested understanding beyond her years. Psychologists consulted by the detectives noted that children often internalize and process emotions visually, but the precision in Emma's renderings, aligned so closely with her father's actual characteristics, was extraordinary. It provided not only investigatory insight, but also an emotional bridge, connecting the daughter to a father she could not consciously remember. For Sarah, this was both hopeful and heartbreaking, a reminder that the family's connection had endured despite the years of absence. As investigators synthesized the new information, a clearer picture emerged. Daniel had likely chosen to leave, not in response to a threat, but as part of a deliberate personal decision. Motives remained speculative, whether driven by self-discovery, an unspoken need for distance, or circumstances that Sarah had never understood. But the evidence indicated calculation rather than chaos. This realization shifted the emotional weight for Sarah. The mystery was no longer defined solely by fear of harm or loss. It was also framed by intention, a complex human choice that existed within the shadows of her daughter's drawings. The investigative team now faced the challenge of translating this reconstructed pattern into actionable leads. Locations were mapped, timelines refined, and minor sightings cross-checked against newly discovered records, with Emma's drawings functioning as an unusual yet compelling tool for spatial and behavioral analysis. Each sketch became a reference point, a subtle but crucial guide in piecing together Daniel's steps after he disappeared. For Sarah, observing the detectives at work with the support of forensic analysis was a bittersweet reassurance. The process confirmed that her years of careful documentation, preservation of photographs, and attention to Emma's artwork had not been in vain. By the close of this phase, the case had transformed. What had begun as a cryptic, seemingly impossible disappearance now carried direction, logic, and potential leads. The years of silence had been punctuated not by randomness, but by a sequence of deliberate movements, patterns slowly revealed through the unlikeliest of mediums, a child's instinctive renderings. Sarah allowed herself cautiously to imagine that the father she had loved and mourned might yet be located, that the mystery could shift from endless questions to tangible answers. The intersection of human intuition, forensic investigation, and Emma's extraordinary talent had opened a door, one that promised to redefine the search and bring the family closer to understanding than it had been in half a decade. The breakthrough came quietly, almost unceremoniously, as investigators followed the final lead, traced from Emma's drawings and the distant relative's recollection. They drove out of the city limits, leaving behind the predictable streets and neighborhoods, venturing into the quieter, wooded outskirts where small cabins and private retreats dotted the landscape. The search had been painstaking, marked by weeks of verification, cross-checking addresses, and examining subtle signs of occupancy. Then, at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense trees that shielded it from view, they found a small, weathered cabin. Its isolation was complete. It had no visible neighbors, no passing traffic, and no outward indication of life. But inside, there was undeniable evidence that someone had lived there in deliberate seclusion. When the door was cautiously opened, the investigators were met not by confrontation, but by the quiet, tense presence of Daniel himself. He was older than the photographs Sarah had kept, but recognizable. The same subtle tilt of the head, the familiar posture captured repeatedly in Emma's sketches. Daniel had been living under an assumed name, carefully removing himself from the world he once knew. For 5 years, he had monitored Sarah and Emma from a distance through sparse online activity and public observation, too fearful to return. Psychological assessments later revealed that his paranoia had roots in a traumatic incident during a hospital visit, a medical mix-up that left him acutely sensitive to being tracked, observed, or even recognized. Returning home, he had feared, could put everyone at risk, including himself. The cabin itself was a reflection of the meticulous care that had marked Daniel's years in hiding. Shelves were lined with photographs, carefully annotated notes, and letters he had written but never sent, each documenting a longing to reconnect with the family he had left behind. He had preserved everything Sarah had sent indirectly: photographs, cards, even the occasional drawings Emma made, which had traveled unknowingly to him through her mother. Investigators noted the precision of his record-keeping and the careful cataloging of time, dates, and events. It was as though the cabin served both as a sanctuary and a shrine to the life he had been forced to observe from afar. Daniel's presence was at once fragile and deliberate. He explained that the psychological burden of returning too soon had been overwhelming. He feared that the trauma he carried would disrupt the delicate lives of Sarah and Emma. Every action he had taken, from choosing the cabin to maintaining strict routines, had been guided by a single unspoken purpose: to protect. Even the letters he had written to Sarah, tucked away in carefully labeled folders, were filled with apologies, reflections on lost time, and the hope that one day she and Emma would understand the reason for his absence. His isolation had been extreme, yet every step had been purposeful, a carefully constructed buffer between himself and the family he still loved. For Sarah, standing on the threshold of the cabin, the moment was surreal. 5 years of uncertainty, fear, and grief converged into an instant of clarity. The man she had mourned, whose disappearance had shaped every moment of her life, was finally before her. Emma, who had spent years communicating in her own subtle way through drawings, seemed to recognize him immediately. Her eyes widened, and for a moment there was a quiet, almost instinctive acknowledgement, a recognition that defied words and spanned the gap of years in absence. It was as though her subconscious had been keeping the connection alive, guiding Daniel back even before he had consciously allowed himself to be found. Investigators documented the cabin methodically, noting each item and its significance. The photographs captured moments from before the disappearance, the letters detailed his emotional state over time, and the drawings, both from Emma and Daniel, revealed an unbroken, invisible thread between father and daughter. Forensic psychologists who later analyzed the scene concluded that Daniel's actions, while extreme, had been driven by a combination of trauma, protective instinct, and deep, persistent love. His seclusion was not avoidance. It was a complex strategy of safeguarding, dictated by fear, yet motivated by hope. The encounter itself was cautious, careful, and deliberate. Daniel spoke sparingly, explaining his choices without excuses, outlining the psychological barriers that had kept him away. He described the intensity of monitoring Sarah and Emma from afar, the balance of seeing them without being seen, the agonizing moments of watching milestones he could not touch, and the letters he had written in solitude. Every word underscored the paradox of his existence, a life lived in proximity yet removed, a father present yet absent, constantly negotiating the line between protection and separation. Sarah, processing the emotional gravity of the discovery, realized that Daniel's absence had never been abandonment in the traditional sense. It had been a careful, deliberate measure born of fear, trauma, and love, a tragic necessity that had shaped the family's trajectory. Emma's drawings, transmitted unknowingly through Sarah, had served as both a beacon and a bridge, compelling him toward eventual reconnection. Each line, each detail in her artwork had whispered to him across years of isolation, guiding him back to the life he had desperately wished to rejoin. As the discovery settled, there was no immediate reconciliation, no sudden resolution of 5 years' worth of uncertainty. Instead, there was a quiet, tentative acknowledgement of presence, of recognition, and of the possibility for the future. Investigators recognized that the case, while technically concluded in terms of locating Daniel, had entered a new phase. The slow, delicate process of rebuilding trust, reconnecting family bonds, and understanding the profound psychological layers that had dictated the trajectory of his disappearance. The cabin, the letters, the photographs, and the drawings together created a narrative of longing, fear, and hope, illuminating the human consequences of trauma and the enduring power of connection. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Daniel began navigating the delicate path toward reunification, guided by Emma's unspoken communication and Daniel's painstaking honesty. The discovery, though delayed by years of silence, had transformed uncertainty into the possibility of understanding. The missing pieces of the puzzle were no longer lost. They had simply waited for the patient convergence of art, intuition, and human resilience to reveal their place. The moment of reunion was quiet, almost hesitant, as if each party feared that reality might shatter under the weight of expectation. Sarah had driven the long stretch to the cabin, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her mind racing with 5 years of unspoken questions. Emma, now a curious, expressive 5-year-old, sat in the back seat with a notebook filled with sketches, images of a man she had drawn countless times, each one echoing the photograph Sarah had kept of Daniel. When the cabin door opened, the figure of Daniel emerged, older, weary and cautious, yet unmistakably familiar. The years of absence hung between them like an invisible wall, but the recognition in their eyes bridged every moment of separation. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his gaze flickering from Sarah to Emma, and then back again, as if measuring the distance that had been forced between them. His voice was low, almost fragile, carrying the weight of the years he had spent in self-imposed exile. He explained haltingly the chain of events that had led him to vanish. Outside the hospital, he had experienced a sudden, overwhelming panic attack, an acute psychological response triggered by a series of miscommunications and a perceived threat he could not rationalize. Every interaction with the staff had been interpreted as hostile or invasive, reinforcing his spiraling mental state. By the time he could think clearly, fear had taken control, and he had retreated, convinced that any attempt to return might endanger Sarah and Emma. Sarah listened, a mixture of shock, sorrow, and relief crossing her features. The gap of 5 years suddenly began to take shape as a timeline of fear, misjudgment, and emotional paralysis. Daniel described his meticulous withdrawal into seclusion, the cabin that became both a refuge and a prison, and the constant internal struggle between longing for his family and fearing the consequences of his return. He spoke of the letters he had written but never sent, the photographs he had preserved, and the obsessive monitoring of any signs of Sarah and Emma's well-being. It was a narrative punctuated by anxiety, but also by an unwavering love that had endured through years of silence. Emma, meanwhile, approached cautiously, her small hands clutching her drawings. She studied him as though confirming the details her mind had held onto for years. Each sketch she had produced, the hairline, the posture, the subtle curve of his smile, was now reflected in the man before her. For Sarah, witnessing the intuitive accuracy of her daughter's artwork was staggering. Specialists had long argued that Emma's reproductions were statistically improbable for a child her age, yet here they were, bridging the 5-year gap, serving as a conduit between father and daughter. Emma's silent communication had guided Daniel without his conscious knowledge, leading him back through a path of instinct and recognition. As the afternoon stretched on, the three of them began to piece together the timeline of absence. Sarah recounted the months after Daniel vanished, the calls that went unanswered, the sightings that led nowhere, and the endless nights spent wondering if he had been harmed or simply abandoned them. Daniel responded with explanations that filled in the blanks, each detail dissolving the misinterpretations that had grown into resentment and sorrow. He described specific moments of panic, the internal calculus that convinced him retreat was the only safe option, and the painstaking efforts to monitor Emma's development from afar. It was a conversation steeped in raw honesty, marked by the delicate balance between confession and preservation of dignity. The emotional gravity of the reunion unfolded slowly, layer by layer. Grief for the lost time mingled with relief at the discovery. Years of misunderstanding unraveled as facts replaced assumptions, and love reaffirmed itself through shared recognition and memory. Sarah and Daniel alternated between silence and explanation, their voices soft but insistent, bridging the years of separation one sentence at a time. Emma watched and listened, occasionally offering a gesture, a drawing, or a quiet observation that tied the narrative together in a way only a child could. Her presence was both anchor and catalyst, a living testament to the persistence of familial bonds despite the odds. Every detail mattered, the small gestures, the tentative touch of hands, and the shared laughter at tiny recollections of daily life all became pieces of an emotional mosaic that neither time nor distance could erase. Sarah saw in Daniel the same features that had drawn her to him years before, the tilt of his head when he smiled, the careful deliberation of his movements, and the protective watchfulness that had never left him. Daniel, in turn, observed the subtle ways Emma mirrored him, from the way she held her drawing pencil to the expression that appeared when she was deeply focused. These mirrored traits reinforced a continuity of connection, underscoring the unbroken thread of parenthood that had survived trauma, fear, and absence. As the evening settled, there was no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures. The presence of all three, together in a shared space, was itself a reconciliation. Conversations about the past were interwoven with gentle explorations of the present and cautious discussions of the future. Plans were tentative, but hope had returned, tangible and quiet, resting in the subtle glances and the soft, unspoken understanding that the family unit, fractured though it had been, could begin to heal. In the end, the reunion became less about the logistics of discovery and more about the affirmation of human resilience. Emma's drawings, Daniel's meticulous seclusion, and Sarah's unwavering devotion had converged to bring truth into focus, transforming years of absence into a new chapter of cautious reconnection. The story of their separation, once a source of uncertainty and despair, had evolved into a testament to intuition, persistence, and the enduring strength of familial bonds. It was not merely a resolution, it was a moment of profound emotional reckoning, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of grief, relief, and the indelible imprint of love. Even after Daniel's return, the aftermath of years spent apart lingered quietly, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Life resumed with Sarah, Daniel, and Emma, but it was fragile and deliberate, each step measured to rebuild the trust that had been fractured. Daniel approached fatherhood cautiously, learning the rhythms of Emma's day, the nuances of her laughter, and the small ways she sought reassurance. Sarah watched, often silently, as the man she had loved and mourned for years navigated the delicate process of reintegration. Their home became a space of careful healing, a place where routines mattered and stability was cultivated deliberately, day by day. Outside the home, the case continued to draw the attention of investigators and psychologists, drawn by its unusual combination of human instinct, trauma, and memory. Emma's drawings had been a key turning point, her childlike reproductions of her father's image guiding the search in ways that defied conventional explanation. Behavioral experts noted how her early artwork, interpreted through a lens of forensic analysis, became an unintentional map of recollection. Overlooked traffic camera footage, once dismissed as irrelevant, and minor witness recollections were pieced together, forming the chain of evidence that finally led to Daniel. The case was studied as an extraordinary example of how memory, intuition, and subtle behavioral cues can intersect to resolve mysteries that seem otherwise unsolvable. Psychologists emphasized the psychological depth of Daniel's response, the acute paranoia and trauma that had led him to isolate himself. Yet they also observed the resilience inherent in human connection, the ability of instinct to bridge years of silence, the way a child's perception can operate beyond statistical probability, and the quiet power of familial bonds to guide lost paths home. The combination of instinct, observation, and empathy had created a roadmap back to safety, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, human perception, fragile as it is, can retain a remarkable capacity for truth. Sarah reflected often on the years of waiting, the uncertainty and the heartbreak, recognizing how chance, intuition, and small details had shaped their path to reunion. The presence of Daniel in their lives again did not erase the past, but it allowed them to reconcile with it, integrating the trauma and the absence into a story that was theirs alone. Emma's intuitive artistry continued to fascinate experts, her sketches now a record of resilience and subtle guidance, a testament to how the youngest among us can sometimes perceive truths adults overlook. The documentary concludes not with a neat resolution, but with a meditation on human fragility and strength. It reminds viewers that perception is never infallible, that memory can endure in extraordinary ways, and that instinct, quiet, patient, and persistent, can illuminate paths that logic alone cannot. Even when the world seems inexplicable, when years pass in silence and despair, the enduring force of connection can bridge absence, trauma, and fear. In the lives of Sarah, Daniel, and Emma, that connection became tangible, guiding them back to one another and offering a quiet hope that even in the darkest, most bewildering times, love, memory, and human intuition can bring lost paths home.